Take WBCM Radio Bristol with you wherever you are in the world with our new app for iPhone and Android, powered by Sugarlands Distilling, stories in every jar. Download now and experience all 3 programming channels: Radio Bristol Classic, Radio Bristol Americana, and WBCM Radio Bristol.
Hey everybody, I'm Winona, and you are listening to Radio Bristol.
All right, Jimmy, let's have a little of that Johnson City Ray.
Broadcasting from the birthplace of country music, this is WBCM LP Bristol.
I'm going across the sea. When I'm gone, I know you won't be missing me. Grown so used to this, I know you won't even watch me go. You won't even count the days I'm gone. You won't think of me for very long. And I'm going across the sea. I wake up one rainy day. Will those cloudy skies make me stop and say, it's an awful shame, a doggone mess, I should have left it all to rest. Should have packed my bags and headed home. Should have settled down and lived alone. I'm going across the sea. stop and cry. Too many friends far and near, too many miles between there and here, too many days for us to be apart. Too many ways to break your own heart. I'm going across the sea. I won't be gone too long, just like I've been saying all along. In every place I hang around, in every bar and every town, thinking about when I come back to you. No, you don't believe me, but it's true. I'm going across the sea. I'm going across the sea.
Welcome into the second hour of the Old Time Jam. I'm your host, Brad Kolodner, with you every week, sharing the latest in old-time string band music. All are welcome to join in on the jam, as we just heard from the Horsenecks, Gabrielle McRae and Barry Southern out of Astoria, Oregon, with Going Across the Sea. For that, Nora Brown on banjo, that's Stephanie Coleman on fiddle with Hills of Mexico, and a new tune from Melissa Chelinsky out of Utah with Mosquito Symphony. Up next on the program, let's hear the latest from Willie Carlisle. Here's the opening track from his new album. Here's Critterland.
So hello, everyone. How are you all tonight? Good, good. Well, welcome to the birthplace of country music. We're so glad to have you here with us at the museum. This is our monthly speaker sessions, and we're very, very pleased to have Andrew Finn Magill with us. This is going to be a really great evening. For those of you who don't know, I'm Renee Rogers. I'm the head curator here at the museum, and my colleague Sam Parker is in the back running tech. We're delighted to be hosting Andrew Finn Magill tonight, and he'll be talking about the relationship between Irish, Scottish, and American fiddle styles and immigration story. And when I say talking, I also mean fiddling, so you'll get some music in between. But before we get started, just a few housekeeping details. The restroom, for those of you who haven't been here before, if you need to go to the restroom, they're just down the hall on the left. If you do need to leave before the program has finished, that is fine, but you'll need to exit from the door that's right outside of this theater instead of the door you came in, because the front of the museum will be locked in about 15 minutes. Audience Q&A, afterwards you'll have the chance to answer a question or to ask questions and get some conversation with Andrew, and also he has brought some of his merchandise, so be sure and check that out and sign up for his mailing list. For those of you who are with us on YouTube, you can put your questions into the comments, and Sam will be keeping an eye on those so we can also get questions from our virtual audience. We always send a survey out within a couple of days of these programs. If you have time, please fill that out. They usually only take a minute or two, but they really help us to plan ahead for further programming here at the museum. And then finally, please consider sharing a donation after tonight's program. For those of you on YouTube, the link is in the comments, but we also have a donation jar up front. The museum offers almost all of our programming is free or low cost, and your donation helps us to continue to make these engaging and accessible to our community, and we really appreciate that support. And now, before we get into the program, let me introduce tonight's speaker. For 20 years, North Carolina native violinist fiddler Andrew Finn Magill, known as Finn to his friends, has been pursuing parallel careers in traditional Irish music, Brazilian choro, did I pronounce that right? Choro, jazz, and American fiddle. Finn. In 2023, he released the Polaris Project on Rope-A-Dope Records, the follow-up to 2021's Festa on the same label, and his quartet is represented by Marsalis Mansion artists. Please now join me in welcoming Finn to the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. We're so glad to have you with us, and we're really excited to learn more about the fiddling styles and immigration stories.
Thank you so much, Renee. And thank you all for coming out this evening, here physically and virtually. And I thought I would give you a little bit. That was an amazing introduction, by the way. That was pretty complete, but I thought I would give you just a little bit more context, a little bit of my backstory to provide a context for what I'm going to talk about, and more importantly, the kind of music I'm going to play. So as Renee mentioned, I'm from North Carolina. I was born and raised in Asheville, North Carolina. And the main reason for that is because my father started something called the Swannanoa Gathering in 1990. I think some people have heard of it. I know I've seen some of you at it before. If you don't know, it's a series of music workshops, and it takes place over 5 weeks. There's 7 different programs over the course of 5 weeks. Each program is themed around a different instrument and or genre. So for example, there is a guitar week, which teaches all sorts of genres as long as they're acoustic, from country fingerstyle blues. I'm going to be talking more about the European side of things in the context of old-time music. There are many different kinds of American music, and even more so now than there were 150 years ago. But the first, like, quintessentially American kind of dance music is what we now call old time. And that term didn't exist back then, but old time was really the result of the music of African peoples forced here to the States and European peoples who came here and brought their music. So both of these different cultures mixed really around the time of the Civil War and gave rise to what we call now old-time music. So I'll be talking more about the European connections, but I mean, unavoidably I'll be talking about the African ones too. I just don't know, haven't quite dove as deep on that end of things. So what I thought I would do, just to give, so you have the sounds of some of these different styles in your ears, and then we can take different tunes and look at how they've changed over time. I thought I would just play a set of music from each one of these regions. And starting with Scottish music, because a lot of the music from this part of the world was actually brought over by the Ulster Scots. So those would have been Scottish people that were forced out of Scotland in the Highland clearances, or just forced immigration to Northern Ireland, and then they eventually migrated to the United States and found their way down here. So there's a very strong Scottish connection. So we'll start there, and then we'll work our way westward until we wind up in Bristol, Tennessee. Or is this Bristol, Virginia? Okay, glad I asked. Okay, so let's see. I'll do 2 different kinds of Scottish music here. In Scotland, there are many different types of music, like all the places that I'm going to talk about. But there are kind of 2 main influences, at least on the fiddling. The first is the music of, without a better term, classical music. So people like J. Scott Skinner, who wrote these very virtuosic tunes for the fiddle, or maybe violin. I think it was a lot more ambiguous back then. And then the kind of Scottish fiddling that is inspired by the pipes, which is essentially Highland pipe music transposed to the fiddle. So I'm going to play, the first is a fiddle tune called King George V. It's a Strathspey, and it's a quintessentially Scottish tune. And then I'm going to play some pipe tunes after that I got from Laura Risk, a wonderful Scottish-style player, and Quebecois, which is a whole other lecture. So King George V and 2 Highland pipe reels. Thank you. Thanks. So a lot of what I guess one of the main things that influences the way these tunes are played is the instruments that they're played on. So for example, those last two tunes were written on the Highland pipes, which have 9 notes, and the scale sounds like this. So they have this beautiful sound in them. Instead of a nice, happy major, which would be A major, we have this note. So that tension is a hallmark sound of these tunes. And you only have 9 notes to work with, so the melodies are kind of restricted to 1 octave, essentially, which is very different than the Irish pipes, which are 2.5 octaves, I believe. And in Ireland, they're called the uilleann pipes, because uilleann is the Irish for elbow. And you play them by pumping the bellows with your elbow. You play them sitting down, pumping the air with your elbow instead of blowing into like a windpipe. And so I'll just share some Irish music with you now so you have that sound in your head. Let's see here. This will be... This is a great tune that I learned in the last few months, actually. I believe it was written by Paddy O'Brien, the accordion player from Tipperary. It's called The Trip to Nina, which is a place in Tipperary. And I'll follow that with the Graps Bay. Thank you. So there's a lot of things, we could talk about the scale of the tunes, but there are a lot of differences in the way we ornament and just feel the tunes. So a lot of the ornaments are going to be based off of the ornaments you would do on a tin whistle or flute or the uilleann pipes. In other words, the instruments native to that genre. So whereas in Scottish music, certainly if it's a pipe tune, we're trying to imitate Highland pipe ornaments. On an Irish tune, the ornaments are different, and so we're imitating more the Irish ornaments. And some of it is pretty obvious. There's an ornament in Irish music called a roll, which is it actually comes from classical music, but it's 5 notes, just played very quickly. And sort of that little shape you can transpose to all sorts of notes. This is an ornament that's pretty conspicuously absent in Scottish music. But in Scottish music, they have other little left-hand techniques that we don't use in Irish music, so it goes both ways. There are other subtle little things, like whereas an Irish player might be more likely to slide. A Scottish player might play a quick hammer-on. That kind of thing. And these are subtle little things that you learn more and more as you plunge deeper and deeper into the music. One thing I didn't address in the Scottish set, there's a very hallmark sound of Scottish fiddling and just Scottish music that when you hear it, you know you're in Scotland, and that's called the Scottish snap. And it's this that sort of quick down-up movement. That kind of thing. And that is all over Scottish strathspeys, which is that kind of tune, and marches. There are different kinds of marches in Scottish music as well. So I'll just pause there. Maybe we'll come back to this subject. There's, each one of these genres is a little Pandora's box of so many different things. Okay, so moving on to this part of the world, like I said we would. I'm going to play an old-time tune from the Round Peak tradition. So Round Peak music, it's the kind of old-time music that I probably had the most exposure to and studied the most when I was learning old-time. And Round Peak is synonymous with people like Tommy Jarrell and Fred Cockram, Benton Flippin. We're talking about Mount Airy, North Carolina, so Surrey County. And there are related styles around that region, but I'll just play you a Round Peak tune, and then we can kind of unpack, what makes it Round Peak. Thank you. So that's a tune called Ducks on the Mill Pond. And so there are many little things that we could talk about, but I'll draw your attention to three. So one is the use of double stops. And sometimes I actually have another fiddle with me that's cross-tuned, so I don't have to awkwardly tune this fiddle back and forth. In round peak fiddling, there are many different kinds of tunings, and this is true of lots of styles of old-time music. This would be standard, but a lot of the tunes are tuned in open tuning, which would sound like this. So just A's and E's, A, E, A, E. There's a G, D, G, D. There's Dead Man's tuning, D, D, A, D, and there are many others. That tune doesn't need cross-tuning, but the point of cross-tuning is so that you can always have this sort of dual fiddle sound, this drone, so you can play two strings at the same time, which you can do on that tune because of the key it's in. But so that's called a double stop. And so that's a pretty important part of the sound of round peak fiddling. And then another big thing is what's called the pulse, which is basically articulating more than one note without changing the bow direction. And the way you do that is by digging in with the bow on an up bow or pulling down on a down bow. So instead of this, which would be articulating every note individually, it becomes... And you can combine that with the double stop. You can start mixing the bowing and that kind of thing. And I was already doing another, the third thing I wanted to talk about, which is anticipating the beat. So unlike Scottish and Irish music where the phrases are very square, right? You tap your foot. The phrase sort of begins and ends where you would tap your foot, right? An Irish tune called Reel of Rio. Whereas in this music, you can feel that pull. I start playing before you would tap your foot. And so that sort of rhythmic anticipation is also a very important part of the sound. And these three things you can mix up in infinite ways, and fiddlers do. That's why there are as many styles as there are fiddlers. But you can use these things to make an otherwise simple melody actually very complex and interesting. So just as an example, a melody I'm sure you all know. I'm sure we recognize that. Does that conjure up like bad memories of third grade having to play that on the recorder? Anyway, it does for me. So that melody is only 3 notes, right? But we can start to layer in these elements of round peak fiddling and old-time fiddling more generally, such as the double stops. Then the pulse. And then anticipating phrases. You know, you could go on and on. So those 3 things, all of a sudden you have this whole new palette to work with. And it makes old-time music actually very complex and very difficult to learn, probably deceptively so if you're just paying attention to the melody. Okay, so moving along in history, let's go to bluegrass, just so you have that sound, and then we'll talk about some of the things that make it different. Because sometimes people don't always know, and some forms of bluegrass sound actually pretty old-timey, depending on the kind of old-time music that you're familiar with. So I'll play you at least one bluegrass tune, maybe 2. This is a tune by Kenny Baker called Grassy Fiddle Blues. And I'll do back up and push after it. Why not? Thank you. So I think it's interesting that that was your biggest applause. And I think that's telling as what I was going to talk about, actually. I mean, this is showbiz music. You know, bluegrass was invented by Bill Monroe in the 1940s, and it was a really revolutionary concept. It took a lot of different forms of music, traditional fiddle tunes being one of them, like Southern fiddling, and just put it on turbo drive. Got Earl Scruggs into the band, and just they started cranking everything up by 100 BPM, and just all these fiddle pyrotechnics, over the years started to emerge. And so there's a lot of just like licks and tricks and things that you don't find in old time music. And the reason is because old time is dance music, and it lives in like square dances and hoedowns, and it's meant to be played for dances. So it's not about flash and showiness and ripping a solo, whereas bluegrass was always meant to be performed on a stage from its inception. So it always had that element of showbiz into it, and that's where you get those crazy things. And there's just, like with Scottish and Irish music, these subtle things that you start to pick up on. The more of the music you learn, the more of these subtle things you just feel like, oh, that feels a little more old time, that feels a little more bluegrass. But some of the other, one of the main things it's a very common way to play bluegrass, which is called the longbow style. So in the round peak style that I was playing earlier, the right hand is pretty much always shuffling, or it's doing something rhythmic. And that's, again, because it's meant to keep time and play for dancers. And just the more rhythmic the bowing, the easier it is to dance to. But the longbow style, what that means is to slur a lot of notes all in the same bow. So, what was the tune I played? So, like that kind of thing. There's a tune by Bill Monroe, Panhandle County. B part. What is it? I haven't played it in a while. So Kenny Baker, when he played that, he plays it all in one note, or one bow. And that is a good example of the longbow style. It allows you to play a lot quicker, but not necessarily as rhythmic. Now, there's an interesting, since we're in Eastern Tennessee, there's an interesting exception to this, because there's always an exception to every rule. Ralph Blizzard, the great old-time fiddle player, actually played longbow style, and he actually improvised a lot, like a bluegrass player would, but it wasn't bluegrass. Especially in this part of Appalachia, like the lines are a lot more blurred, actually, between bluegrass and old-time. And a tune, I think, which is an example of that, this is a tune that I got from Roger Howell in Madison County. Anyone ever been to Madison County, North Carolina? All right. So they have a beautiful style of music that they call mountain music. And it's not old time, it's not bluegrass, it lives somewhere in between. And unlike the round peak style, they don't use alternative tunings. Everything is played in this tuning, standard. They play things like jigs and Strat Spays, and it's very different. For me, when I first heard it, my only reference was the more round peak stuff and the drone-y stuff. So it's very different because it doesn't really use drones. It doesn't use, a lot of the tunes aren't crooked like you would find in round peak. Crooked is when you don't have even measures, and that happens a lot in not just round peak, but various kinds of old time and bluegrass. So here's a tune that I got from Roger. Met him a few years ago at his fiddle shop, and it is called Hiram's Hornpipe, which is a very telling name, because a hornpipe is a kind of tune from the British Isles. And when he first learned this, he learned it as Herm's hornpipe from a Texas fiddle player, which is a whole other lecture, along with the Quebecois stuff. Also amazing music, but very different. So here's Hiram's hornpipe, just so you can hear what another form of old time sounds like. Thank you. So just to compare a little bit, I'll play that last B part a few different ways so you can hear how fiddlers of different inclinations might play that. And I'll just play the B part because that part's a little easier to illustrate these differences. So here it is in a more round peaky way. So that would be round peak. More bluegrass would be. Just to and this, I think, hopefully you'll find this the most interesting. So this is how I would play it with like my Irish brain on. Because this is called a hornpipe, that means a very specific sort of rhythm and tempo in Ireland. So this is how I would play that. Thanks. So in Ireland, a hornpipe, I'm not sure if hornpipes actually are Irish per se. There's only one Irish tune that we know without a shadow of a doubt that is Irish, and that's the slipjig. Even though they play probably 12 to 15 different kinds of tunes in Ireland, from reels to jigs to polkas, slides, barn dances, flings, highlands, mazurkas, goes on. But they all came from somewhere else except for the slipjigs. But the hornpipes are interesting because they have this very specific bounce to them, and they can be, not always, they can be very virtuosic. And I'll just play you an Irish hornpipe so you have a sense of what that sounds like. There's one hornpipe that's actually very famous, you may have heard. So this bouncy quality, that's a hornpipe. So here's another hornpipe. I won't play that one, it's been played to death. Thank you. So that's Minnie Foster's Clog. Now we'll get to the maybe what you've all been waiting for, which is to show you some of these specific tunes which still exist in all these traditions and how they've changed a little bit. So there's a hornpipe in Ireland called the Boys of Blue Hill that has an American, not cousin, ancestor, not ancestor, descendant. You know, I hesitate because it's unclear if it was exactly linear like this. I think, you know, all these different genres were kind of cross-pollinating with each other, especially once they made it over here. But I'm not an ethnomusicologist, so I can't say for sure. I'm just a fiddler. So I'll just play the tunes. So the Irish tune is The Boys of Blue Hill, and the American version is called Twin Sisters. American version. Twin Sisters. By the way, I got that tune from the great Kentucky fiddle player, Matt Brown, who's a great banjo player as well. Let me just give you one more example of some of these tunes, how they've changed, and then maybe we can open up the floor to questions. I have no idea how we're just chatting away here. Oh, got plenty of time? Okay. Okay. I'll just give you one more example of, there aren't a lot of these kinds of tunes in American music, but marches. And I think that's as clear an indicator as any there's a Scottish connection, because that's a huge part of the piping repertoire in Scotland. There are marches in Ireland too, but it's not a thing like it is in Scottish music. When you play sets of this music, and we never just play one tune like we would. Like in the States, you just play one tune, like Billy in the Low Ground or Fisherman's Hornpipe. But in Ireland and Scotland, you always put tunes together in sets. And in Scotland, it's really common, if not almost sacrosanct, to have an air, march, strathspey, reel. So marches are a pretty big, important part of the repertoire. But I'll play you maybe 3 different marches, so you can hear how each one sounds. So an American march called Coleman's March, and then, let's see here, a Scottish march called the Aired Ranters, and then an Irish march called, blanking on the name, but I got it from the Uilleann piper Kieran O'Hare out of Kansas City. Thank you. I wanted to play some marches just to show you that's an example of a tune that is more or less maintained its tempo, where, you know, with the hornpipes, once they made it over to Appalachia and beyond, they just became dance tunes. They just became fiddle tunes like any others. But the marches are still more or less played marchable. I mean, you got to be able to march to them, right? So, all right. With that, all that, I'm going to take a drink of water, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions.
Yes, so we do have lots of opportunity for questions. If you do want to ask a question, wait till I get the mic to you so that we can be sure that folks online can see. Apparently I was not in shot, and now I am. So yeah, we want to be sure that they can hear the question. So anyone want to start us off? I have a lot of questions, so.
So it seems like the Irish tunes have more slides, more little things like that, and the Scottish seems really precise. Is that kind of the Scottish tunes are right on the beat, and the Irish tunes slide a little bit more, a little bit. Is that somewhat true?
That's a great observation. I like what you said about precise, because if you go to like a Scottish fiddling contest,
right.
I mean, you're basically evaluated down to the up bow. Like, it's very specific. And, you know, I talked in the beginning there how there's kind of two camps of Scottish fiddling. One is more related to the piping tradition, and the other one is more related to classical music. So I think because of that classical connection, there's just more of a school of playing in the classical way where, like, you know, there's more of a tradition of reading sheet music. In that part of Scotland, or by this point all over Scotland, whereas in Ireland to this day, like, I mean, people learn way more by ear than they would by sheet music.
That was my next question.
Yeah.
One more thing I observed on your bluegrass style was the vibrato, that you were using a lot more of that on the vibrato, more vibrato on the bluegrass style compared to the Irish and the Scottish.
Yeah, I didn't talk about that, but I was going to, so thanks for reminding me. So, yeah, there is vibrato in bluegrass, but it's different than the Scottish vibrato. So, the Scottish vibrato is, first of all, there's pretty much no vibrato in Irish music. Like, even if you listen to the singing, it's all straight toned, just like the Appalachian ballad singing. But in Scottish music, you have a lot more vibrato, and I think that's probably because of the relationship to classical music in some way. But so for that reason, the vibrato sounds more classical. So. Whereas in bluegrass, we have what I like to call country vibrato. So, what's the tune? If you listen to someone like Kenny Baker, you can really hear that. Instead of, as soon as I hear that in bluegrass, I'm like, whoa, this kind of does my head in a little bit. But yeah, so there is vibrato. It's just different.
Anyone else?
Can you really define vibrato? I mean, I kind of hear it, but what exactly does that mean?
So vibrato, from the Italian for vibrate, right? So you're vibrating your hand. So without it, it would sound like this. So, like, to take that tune, that's with no vibrato, right? With the classical vibrato, with a country vibrato. So it's just, to vibrate your hand, and it creates this wobble in the note, which is it's actually what music wants to do anyway. It's a natural thing. And So by adding vibrato, it's just giving it, I don't know, just makes it more musical sounding.
Do we have any on the YouTube, Sam? No? Well, oh, I see one up here.
Hey, Finn, could you play an example of a slip jig?
Sure. Well, first of all, let's define a jig so we know what the slip is about. So the easiest way to remember the difference between a jig and a reel, a jig has 3 letters, and you count them in 3. Wait, there was more. So you count them in 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So there are 2 groups of 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Reel has 4 letters, and as you guessed it, you count them in 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I didn't get into this too much, but pretty much all the American fiddle tunes are in 4/4. And the only tunes that aren't are the waltzes, really. But in Irish music, there are all sorts of time signatures from 2/4 to 3/4 to 4/4 to 6/8 to 9/8, which is what a slip jig is. So a slip jig is 3 groups of 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So a jig would be like. And a slip jig would be like. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And there's even another kind of tune in Irish music, which is sometimes called a slip jig, sometimes called a hop jig. And it can be a little confusing because it's also in 9/8, but it has more of a 3 feel, like the way a waltz would. So an example of that is, let's see. One, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, versus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So they're both in 9, they're just felt a little differently. And that's a slip jig.
Anyone else?
A march, I was going to ask what a march is. I think you may have explained it, but let me just be sure I understand. So a march is a very consistent, rhythm to it versus other things that tend to move more. Is that correct?
Well, I guess they all have pretty like strong downbeats, but the march probably has even a stronger downbeat because you're marching. But marches can be in 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, even 6/4. But I think one of the telltale signs with a lot of these tunes is the shape of the melody. So, the jigs, the reels are just notes everywhere, right? Like eighth notes. So. Just never stops, right? Whereas marches. Well, let's take a different march. Maybe like the Irish march I played. So the melody is it's not as busy and it's a little more open. There are longer notes in there, and that's true of American marches, Irish marches, Scottish marches. But they also tend to just be a little straighter in the sense that they're not swung. So swung would be like you think of swing, right? I'm trying to think of a tune here. That would be very swung versus would be straight, right? You can hear the difference. So marches tend to be straighter like that.
Okay, you've talked about the tune types that came down into Appalachia, the reels and some of the other things. And why did jigs not? And I've heard different theories. What's yours?
I've heard a lot of theories, and a lot of them are fun, like at parties to just throw around. But I think the real reason is that 4/4 was probably it's called common time for a reason, and I think it was a time signature that both cultures had in common. So, if you listen to African music, which is the whole other piece of this puzzle, African music is amazingly rhythmic and rhythmically complex. And that's the reason old time is. As we said earlier, the melodies can be quite simple, like Bow Them Cabbage Down, but there's all this other stuff going on, which comes from Africa. So you have many different time signatures, if they even think of it that way. I'm not sure they even count them necessarily. But I think 4/4 is probably just a time signature that both cultures recognized, and so it stuck. I don't think it was because you can't play in 6/8 on the banjo. That's what you always hear, but I've heard people do it. I know it can be done, so yeah, that's my theory.
Nope. Is it a YouTube one? Okay. Then I'll come back down here.
One of our online viewers asks, is it true that a violin and a fiddle is the same instrument, just played differently?
Which punchline to go to? Yes, that is true. The easiest answer is yes. It's the same instrument. I mean, I think part of what gave rise to that maybe myth that they are different is that fiddlers might do different things to their instruments to be able to play, like for old time music, they might flatten the bridge because you're playing two strings at the same time so often. Things like putting a rattlesnake in there or playing down here. Remember, like, this is folk music, so people didn't have lessons. They heard it on the radio and they just picked up the fiddle and, or maybe their dad taught them or mom and they didn't have lessons either. So, when you look at people playing like this traditional music, especially from 100 years ago, they look completely different than a violinist. But it's them, it's not the instrument.
And when we do banjo bingo with school groups, we tell them that the difference between a violin and a fiddle is that one has strings and one has strings.
Yes, yeah.
Well, that's our answer.
There's another big difference too. It's a violin when you're selling it. It's a fiddle when you're buying it.
So if people are, like me, hopelessly classically trained, but you kind of miss I would like to get back to some of these roots. Uh-huh. What's the pathway? How do you what's the step-by-step, like, I don't know, historically responsible, or like, I don't know, what ways do you prefer to introduce people to, you're so systematic, here's the Scottish, here's the Irish, here's the, I would love to be able to, know my way around those different styles. How do you do that in a way that's not completely disorganized?
Sure. Well, I think the easiest way is the great thing about, and by the way, you have a lot to choose from here. There's a lot of different genres, but if you wanted to learn more about traditional American music, traditional American fiddling, the great thing about it is that for almost any tune we have what's called source recordings. And so you can go back to the 1930-something, whatever recording it was that John Lomax made or whoever it was, and you can listen to Clyde Davenport play 5 Miles from Town, or you can listen to, fill in the blank, anyone play that tune. And so what, in old-time music, the way we learn is we go to the source recordings, and we just, it's scratchy. You might have to tune the fiddle down a half step, but you just sit there with the recording as long as it takes until you get it. And it's definitely a workout, but all this music is oral based. There's no tradition of sheet music, so that's the only way you can learn the tunes. And obviously, like, the goal is to not, kudos to your ear if you can match bowing for bowing like they're doing. But the goal is just to get as close as you can get and at least be able to understand and recognize what you're listening to. And so that's, I mean, I've spent thousands of hours of my life just sitting there at Scratchy Recordings, transcribing these tunes. Like, not transcribing them this way, but this way. So that's what I would say. And that's, you know, that's honestly true for Irish and Scottish music too. There's always going to be recordings, so just learn it from the greats.
And that actually goes hand in hand with one of the questions I had, because as a historian, we've done a lot of work here about connecting some of the old ballads to some of the music that's recorded in the 1920s and 30s, the child ballads, and you know the work that Cecil Sharp did and others. Is there a similar scholarship that's sort of tracing the tunes as opposed to the song lyrics that can take us back as far as like some of those ballads can be taken?
Wow, Renee, I tell you what, so this whole lecture series started with that mission.
Oh.
And I'm not the first one to attempt to do this. It's just so hard because, you know, like when you're dealing with lyrics, like you can find a sequence of words. And this is true in tunes too, a sequence of notes that pops up in other tunes or other songs. But because we're talking about so much time that's elapsed, and because so many of these tunes weren't written down, like the nice thing about a ballad, you can go back to like the 1860s, you can see the lyrics. It's like, oh, this is that song. There's no recording of this fiddle tune from the 1860s. So we're just, it's like a lot of clever guesswork, because sometimes the title, it's like, wait a minute, I recognize that tune, but that's not the title. Or I recognize that title, but that's a completely different tune. And so there's, you know, this is like, you go to any old time jam, eventually people are going to start talking about this. They'll be like, I don't think that that's that tune. Or it's like, well, it's from that recording. And people can get super nerdy about this. That's the fun part, though.
We like super nerdy here, so.
But you know what's interesting? This is one of my little theories, completely contestable. So feel free. A lot of the tunes which have persisted through the years, you know, into Appalachian and American music, have Scottish counterparts. And I think that it's not a coincidence that so much more of Scottish music was written down, because, you know, it's going back to writing stuff down, lyrics or melodies. You know, you can go back to tune books, you know, and you find some of these same tunes in English tune books and Scottish tune books, but there was and still is a little bit more of that just tradition of like writing music down in Scotland. And so I think that's the reason that you find tunes like Miss McLeod's or Devil's Dream or, you know, Lord MacDonald's, which is thought of as an Irish tune, but, you know, MacDonald is an Ulster Scots name, so I think there's probably a connection there, you know. But I think that's a huge reason why we're a lot more sure about the Scottish ones than the Irish ones. But
awesome.
Just my theory.
Thank you. Anybody else have any final questions for Finn? I do have a final question, but I was going to give someone else a chance first. My other question is, I know you said that you haven't gone as much in depth with the connections with the African antecedents or the African traditions. But, you know, when we talk, obviously the banjo has that direct connection because of the origins of the banjo coming out of West Africa. The fiddle doesn't have those same direct connections, instrument-wise at least, but there were a lot of black fiddlers, especially playing at some of these white entertainments, both during the period of slavery and afterwards. Where do you see that influence, do you see that influence in the fiddle tunes themselves in distinctive ways?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, well, the first thing I would say, if you look in the United States where there was slavery, where there was more of an African and African-American presence, you find more of that influence. So if you go to places like New England, like New England contradance music, which in a way is like, it's old-time music, but it's not. And the reason I say it's not is because you really need the African component for it to be old-time. There just wasn't the same African influence on that traditional music. And so, unsurprisingly, when you hear like fiddle tunes from Maine or New England, they just don't have as much of that bluesy and that lonesome sound, or whatever you want to call it, as they do in places like Kentucky or North Carolina or the South, because there was slavery and there was, African Americans. So, but to be more specific, I mean, I talked about some of the rhythmic variations, like the blues scale, which comes from the pentatonic scale, is a huge part of American music. I think personally, all of American music is built on the blues, the African blues. So the pentatonic scale. So the pentatonic scale, penta, so 5, right? 5 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we have an octave. So that's a scale all over West Africa and probably all over the world. But the blues scale, blues, by the way, is a much larger subject, but here's the scale anyway. So a minor blues scale. So we just add 1 note. So that's basically just this scale with a chromatic note. Now if we start that same scale on this note, now we have a major blues scale. So what's really interesting about this scale is that it's both minor and major. If you don't speak music, minor is like the sad sound, and major is the happy sound. So, well, here's major. Nice, glorious C major. And just by changing 1 note, now we have C minor. So what determines whether it's major or minor is whether it's that note. Now this scale has built into it both the minor and the major note. So which is it? Which is it? Any takers? It's both, which is a concept that just does not exist in Western music. And so that is a clear, like, African thing, because that is completely outside Western music. So what that means is you could play over. It shouldn't make sense, but it does. And so I think that is like a very important thing. Once you recognize that, you start to hear it in rock, you start to see it in jazz, bluegrass, R&B. It's everywhere, and it's everywhere because everything is built on the blues.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. Anybody else have a final question before we end the program? No? Well, before we go, before we thank Finn again for a really, really amazing program tonight, I do want to just say that we have a few things coming up that you all might be interested in, and I just want to share those with you. Our next speaker sessions is on Tuesday, July 9th at 7 p.m., and then we'll have Radio Bristol DJ Lonnie Salyer here talking about record collecting. He'll be here in person and also online. If you haven't had a chance to go see our current special exhibit, A Cardboard History of Blue Ridge Music, it is here through July 21st, so we've got it for just about a little over a month left, so be sure and check that out before it goes. Saturday, June 15th, we will be across the street at the Juneteenth celebration, so if you are there, come and say hi to us. Saturday, June 22nd, we have our monthly Bluegrass Jam. It is 2 to 4 this month rather than 2 to 5, so if you are a bluegrass jammer, you'll only have two hours with us this time because we have so much going on at the museum that day. Friday, July 5th at 10:30 a.m., we have our monthly museum story time where we are reading one of my favorite books, Cowboy Bunnies. And then Saturday, July 6th at 1 p.m., we have author Daniel Siddiqui, who will be here doing a book launch and signing for his most recent travel book called Jammin' Through the South, where he dedicates, I believe, an entire chapter to Bristol and its region, perhaps. I'm asking Erica because she knows more about this than me, but she looks as confused as I do. So come and see. We don't know. Yes. But it's going to be a cool book, and he's launching it from here. So those are some things to look out for in the future. But right now, in the present, let's just say a big thank you to Andrew Finn Magill for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much.
And do check out his merchandise, sign up for his mailing list, find out where he'll be next, and I think I'd really love to have you back sometime, so maybe he'll be here soon. Okay, thank you all.